on the movement of the times. I like to create a question in the beginning of my writing, and by the end of the writing, I'll answer the question and transition to my final question. So, starting off, is the main factor in what a person can become and believe in primarily based off the period of time he or she is born in. The suppression of the person has been seen throughout history. For example, of the African American. While there are different types of suppression, such as redlining and Jim Crow laws, the type of suppression being addressed is that through fear. In 2022, there was a Buffalo supermarket shooting where a self proclaimed white supremacist, Peyton Gendron, shot and killed 10 African Americans in a racially motivated attack, where the defense attorneys argued that he wouldn't get a fair trial in the state where he was charged and wanted to move that trial to Buffalo, New York, from Buffalo to New York City. In 2015, there was a shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, where Dylan Roof shot 10 African Americans and killed 9 at an African Methodist Episcopal church. That attack was seen and treated as a federal hate crime, which led to the removal of 3 Confederate statues, just for the Unite the Right rally to take place in 2017 at the University of Virginia. This protest was led by white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and other white supremacists. When Black Lives Matter supporters came to protest as well, the white supremacist James Alex Fields drove his car into the crowd, killing one woman and injuring 19 others. What were his charges, you may ask? 1 count of second-degree murder, 3 counts of malicious wounding, and 1 count of hit and run. What I just stated happened over the span of 7 years, and this is not mentioning El Paso Walmart shooting that happened in 2019 and the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting that happened in 2018 that targeted other minority groups. This is just only the beginning to the countless unrecorded and recorded attacks that have taken place over the course of American history towards minority groups. But problems don't just start and stop on American soil. Leading to the next topic, the suppression of a person's beliefs also have been seen throughout history, one of the largest and best examples being the banning and censoring of heliocentric ideas. This was done by the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, and while the idea wasn't solely discovered by Copernicus himself, the ideas flourished with his research and observations, only hitting the most controversial point with Galileo in the early 16th century. Picture this: the year 1543, you lay on your deathbed, grasped by disease and old age, surrounded by friends and family alike. You cling on to what little life you have left to find the meaning of it all, until you are presented with your life's work ready to be published, and in that moment you find peace and pass on. Or so the legend says. The story I just told is that of the man who is the founder of the heliocentric idea, or theory, Nicholas Copernicus. The book in question is called De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium. In English, this translates to On the Movements of Heavenly Bodies, On the Revolution of Heavenly Bodies. This book proposed observations made by astronomers from over a 400 century time period, and from Copernicus himself. The question begs to be asked, why did it take so long for these observations to be published, and why by an elderly man on his deathbed at that? Based off of the information found, he was unsure to the very end about how his work would be received. Him being involved in the Catholic Church, he understood how deeply seated the geocentric idea was seen by Catholic and Protestant believers alike. And since he was a canon of the church, this didn't help. As a believer himself, he was afraid of the scrutiny that he would face from Pope Paul III, and due to the fact that astronomers of that time couldn't agree on a singular idea and on an agreed upon basis, he decided to post his observations and formulas from another angle in comparison to other astronomers. Such as Ecophantus and Philolaus, the Pythagoreans. This led to Copernicus creating 7 postulates that would later be built upon in his book. These postulates became known as a separate work, the Commentarials, meaning little commentary, and it was shared among friends. One of those friends being Nicholas von Stroutenberg, Archbishop of Kappa, who would later ask for a personal copy and urge Copernicus to publish his findings. Along with Stromberg, several cardinals within the church, including Pope Clement VII, knew of the work at this time. And for 28 years, it would stay known to only a select few until in 1542, Copernicus was convinced by his followers and student Rickus to publish his book, with him just barely seeing the final production before his death in 1543. Around 1609, Galileo was the chair of mathematics at the University of Prague, where he disproved two of Aristotle's claims regarding motion and trajectory of projectiles. Soon after, he heard of an instrument called a telescope, which was used to see objects far away. After essentially brute forcing the creation, he created his own version of the telescope, and it didn't take long for him to improve that version to have a high enough magnification power to see faraway celestial bodies. After presenting his improvements to the Venetian Senate, Galileo began to use this instrument to make observations on the heavenly bodies in the fall of the same year in 1609. It was then he realized that the sun was the center of the universe through many observations. Galileo became first noticed by the church's Inquisition when his friend and colleague Caesar Cremonini was charged with being an atheist and teaching the heresy of dual truth. This problem was only personified when his letter to Benito Castelli, a friend and follower, got submitted to the Roman Inquisition by Father Nicolai Lorini. This promoted an investigation into the claims that this letter's objective was to reinterpret the Bible. So in order to make sure that they have the whole context of the letter, a cardinal got in contact with Benito Castelli to get the original version. Galileo catches wind of this and makes edits to the letter, ultimately being found as not guilty by any wrongdoings by another separate group of theologians by sending in a milder version of his arguments. Despite this, he was still called to Rome to defend his ideas. Francisco Ignoli then disputed Galileo over the Copernican system and assumed to be on the church's behest. Using those essays, which Galileo himself admits the subsequent actions taken by the Inquisition against Copernicanism can be directly linked to this debate. In 1616, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium was placed in the Index of Forbidden Books unless changes were made, and as well as the first volume of Johannes Kepler's Epitome of Copernican Astronomy. At the same time, under direct orders of Pope V, Cardinal Robert Bellemere made it so Galileo was ordered to not touch or defend the heliocentric idea in any way whatsoever, either orally or in his writing. While this may have been a big blow to Galileo, the last and most controversial part about Galileo's history didn't start until 1624 when he met with Pope Urban VIII. Urban VIII asked Galileo to write about his theories of the universe and to not show favor to either Copernicanism or to address the ideas hypothetically. The name of this book was called The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. In the book, there were three characters portrayed representing different ideas. Savolti argues for Copernicus views and presents some of Galileo's research. And he was named after Galileo's real-life friend, Filippo Savolti. Sagrado, who is initially neutral, is also Galileo's friend, Giovanni Fresco Sagreto. Lastly, Simplicio, portrayed as a dedicated follower of Ptolemy and Aristotle ideas, uses Tycho Brahe's geo-heliocentric ideas. Simplicio is also named after Galileo's friend and colleague, Cassier Cremonini, but was thought to be named after Simplicius of Cilicia. The book is set for the duration of 4 days, and each day represents a chapter. And over the course of those days, arguments are presented that the imperfections and movements on the imperfections and the movements of the universe, ultimately concluding with Galileo's new theory about tides as conclusive evidence for Copernicism. As you can imagine, Galileo's work was not seen was seen as being in favor of Copernicism, and he allegedly made Simplicio the most ridiculed character in the dialogue, and say something along the lines of God could have made the universe in any way he wanted to and still made it appear to us the way it does. This work was this work was written in Italian and in a way that the general populace could easily understand. So after the completion of the book was sent to Rome for censoring, but since there was a plague outbreak, Galileo made the request that the censoring be done in Florence. The Rome censor had stated that there were a number of criticisms he had about the book, but due to the confusion and Galileo writing a preface stating that the claims were hypothetical, there were little to no trouble with the publication in the year 1632 in Florence, and it did not take long for Pope Urban VIII to act. Galileo was then called to Rome, where he was brought before the Inquisitor Venanzio, and was pleaded and had to plead his case that he did not defend Copernicism. But after some debate, he was convinced to admit that the reader could mistakenly get the idea that he was in defense of the theory, and so Galileo was taken in for his final interrogation, where he was threatened with torture to get an admission of guilt at the age of 69. He was never tortured, but despite the threats, and was charged with vehemently suspecting of heresy, which is just a lesser charge of heresy. He was then made to publicly denounce and abjure heliocentrism, and he was sentenced to formal imprisonment, but the next day was dropped down to house arrest for the rest of his life. And while this wasn't announced at the trial, all of his prior and future works would be banned. Despite this, under house arrest, he wrote The Two New Sciences in 1638, which some people consider his finest work, publishing it in Holland to avoid censoring. He later went completely blind in 1638, developing a hernia as well as insomnia, going to Florence for treatment. Galileo died later in 1642 at the age of 77 in Arcetri. As can be seen, depending on the time period and the predominant ideas of the time tend to be more widely accepted than the truth. And when those ideas are connected to something that is seen as a truth, it tends to have a greater effect. Another way to understand this is through the quote by Ridkis when addressing Protestant worries. As persons who seek the truth about things, he wrote, we distinguish in our minds between appearance and reality. The scripture of the Bible can be interpreted in many different ways and has been for centuries. Many individuals, especially people in power, have used their interpretations and justification to denounce people's ideas over the course of history. A simple example is how slave owners used Apostle Paul talks about slavery in justification of owning slaves themselves, when in reality the slavery that Paul addresses are about the slaves that are won during the conquering of nations or indentured servitude. But since the majority of people didn't care to know or didn't care to question such ideas, for centuries African American slaves were tortured and separated from their families and persecuted. So the question should be asked, is the truth only apparent to those who can distinguish a lie from within the perceived truth of opinion? And with the answer to this question being yes, because the only way to distinguish a truth from a lie is to find the lie itself. This is done through the presence of people who are willing to challenge ideas for the pursuit of finding the truth, because the act of keeping the lie around has been seen to be more beneficial than admitting its existence.